On Sunday, March 31st, 1968, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. preached to the congregation at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. He called his sermon, "Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution." Dr. King gave hundreds of sermons in his role as a Baptist minister. But this was to be his final homily, the last time he rose to preach to a Sunday morning church service. The title of my lecture is 5 Revolutions, and I dedicate it to the memory of Dr. King and in honor of the life and work of Reverend James Lawson. The central trope of Dr. King's National Cathedral homily is the cautionary tale of Rip Van Winkle, the protagonist of a classic American short story published in 1819 by Washington Irving, a major literary figure in the early years of the New Republic. You may be familiar with Irving's story, even if you didn't know who wrote it, because it's achieved a kind of mythic status and become a universal fable. You may remember the character, Rip Van Winkle, as a kind but extremely lazy man who years before had come from Holland to settle in rural New York near the Hudson River. One day, Van Winkle wandered alone from his village up to the Catskill Mountains with his favorite shotgun and his loyal dog. He sat down and fell asleep. When he woke up, he rubbed his eyes. He looked for his musket, but only found an old gun, broken down and rotten. He can't find his dog anywhere. He rubs his face. In astonishment, he realizes that he's grown a long, grizzled beard. He finds his way back to the village and doesn't recognize anyone. What's going on? The answer is shocking. Somehow, Rip Van Winkle has slept for more than 20 years. Well, this is an amusing old tale, but why does it interest Dr. King? He focuses on part of the story that is, quote, almost completely overlooked: the portrait hanging in the village pub. In the days before Van Winkle went up to the mountain, he would drink beer beneath a picture of King George III of England in his majestic red robes. But 20 years later, the picture of King George had been taken down and replaced by another, a portrait of a distinguished-looking stranger wearing a blue general's uniform with the name George Washington engraved beneath. Who's this man? Of course, Washington was the general of the American forces in the Revolutionary War and the first president of the United States of America. And this is where King finds the theme of his sermon. Not merely that Rip slept 20 years, King said, but that he slept through a revolution. While he was peacefully snoring up in the mountain, a revolution was taking place that at points would change the course of history. And Rip knew nothing about it. He was asleep. Yes, he slept through a revolution. Here, Dr. King draws his key message for his parishioners, a lesson for the present day. One of the great liabilities, he said, of life is that all too many people find themselves living amidst a great period of social change, and yet they fail to develop the new attitudes, the new mental responses that the new situation demands. They end up sleeping through a revolution. Remember that King is speaking in the spring of 1968, nearly 50 years ago. What is the current ongoing revolution to which he refers? In a sense, King says, it's a triple revolution. That is, a technological revolution with the impact of automation and cybernation. That's King's word. Then there's a revolution in weaponry with the emergence of atomic and nuclear weapons of warfare. And then there's a human rights revolution with the freedom explosion that's taking place all over the world. Wake up, King is saying. A great revolution is taking place around you right now. Are you going to sleep through it, or are you going to engage in history? What side will you be on? And what action will you take? 4 days later, on Thursday, April 4th, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Why had King come to Memphis? he'd accepted an invitation from his close friend, Reverend James Lawson, to join forces with sanitation workers in that city who had risen up to protest against poverty wages and unsafe life-threatening working conditions. Here is Lawson and King at a press conference about the strike. And here is Lawson joining King for a meeting in room 306 of the Lorraine Motel on Wednesday, April 3rd. That night, the last of his life, Dr. King spoke to an overflowing crowd at the Bishop Charles Mason Temple to rally support for the strikers. Why had King come to Memphis, especially when the situation was so dangerous and he had so many other priority demands on him as a pastor and national figure? King explained, "The question is not, if I stop to help this man in need, what will happen to me? Rather, if I do not stop to help the sanitation workers, what will happen to them? That is the question." Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and killed the following day on this same balcony. The Lorraine Motel is now the site of the National Civil Rights Museum, powerful memorial and heritage site. And I urge you to go there if you ever have a chance to visit Memphis or anywhere in the region. Earlier this year, I attended a talk by the same James Lawson at a conference at UCLA. At 86 years old, Reverend Lawson is one of the most powerful and inspiring speakers I've ever heard. In his remarks, he echoed and extended Dr. King's theme of moral, social, and political revolution. I was struck by something very unusual, and I think very powerful that he said, suggesting a new way of thinking about this country and our own political lives. Students throughout the United States study in American history the American Revolution in middle school and often in high school. But if we look carefully at the sweep of American history he observed, we clearly recognize two American revolutions. What did Reverend Lawson mean? Well, the first American Revolution is familiar to us. It's the one Rip Van Winkle slept through, the Revolutionary War against English colonial rule. George Washington's army was victorious, thus his famous portrait replaced that of King George III in Van Winkle's village pub. This revolution, achieved through military combat, was a political revolution, throwing off a colonial master and establishing a new independent nation. The American Revolution also harnessed a tremendous moral force, eloquently articulated by Thomas Jefferson and the nation's founding fathers in the opening paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration proclaimed to the world that the new American Republic would be founded upon radical, uncompromising principles of democracy, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The sole purpose of democratic government is to secure these rights. Thus, the just powers of government are derived exclusively from the consent of the governed. These are fundamental principles, not only of national independence, but a human rights revolution. Martin Luther King often argued that the promises of the Declaration of Independence were the initial spark of the human rights revolution of modern democratic civilization. Promises which the Black freedom struggle in the United States vowed to realize and fulfill in the present day. Tragically, however, the first American Revolution was founded on a historic compromise built into the new U.S. Constitution to permit the former slave-holding colonies of the South to become slave-holding states in the new republic. Without this compromise, the framers believed it would be impossible to forge a single unified nation from all the British colonies. Of course, compromises are necessary in political life. This, however, was a morally rotten compromise, a worm in the apple, a radical evil in the founding architecture of the new republic that fatally corrupted its claim to democracy and human rights. What do I mean by the term rotten compromise and radical evil? Here I refer specifically to the Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit. For Margalit, a rotten compromise is an agreement that establishes or maintains an inhuman political order based on systematic cruelty and humiliation as its permanent features. Usually the party that suffers the cruelty and humiliation is not a party to the agreement. By humiliation, I mean dehumanization, treating humans as non-humans. By cruelty, I mean a pattern of behavior that willfully causes pain and distress. A rotten compromise that establishes or maintains an inhuman regime of cruelty and humiliation is an assault on morality itself. And that is what makes it radically evil. The compromise made to forge a unified nation, a more perfect union of all former American colonies, North and South, was a rotten compromise because it maintained and codified into law a brutal, inhumane, totalitarian system of white supremacy based on the enslavement of African Americans. It was rotten and it proved short-lived. As the new nation expanded its territorial boundaries westward, conflict renewed between the slave states and the free states regarding the status of the new territories. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 kept the Union together for 3 more decades, but it too was a rotten compromise, empowering Southern slave owners to capture and retrieve former slaves who had escaped to freedom in the northern states. The North tried to buy peace, or at least to purchase breathing room to resolve tensions with the South, without descending into bloodshed. But such a corrupt and cynical deal, born of desperation and moral bankruptcy, could not hold. In February 1861, 7 Southern slave-holding states seceded from the Union, declaring themselves the Confederate States of America under the presidency of Jefferson Davis. 2 months later, Confederate soldiers attacked the U.S. garrison at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, launching a vicious, bloody civil war. During the next 4 years, the combined deaths of soldiers and civilians totaled over 1 million souls. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation by executive order on January 1st, 1863, freeing the slaves who were living in the states in rebellion and enabling them to join the Union forces as free men. Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox on April 9th, 1865. Before Christmas of that year, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution abolishing slavery was adopted, having been ratified by the required number of states. Following the war, Reconstruction involved a comprehensive military occupation by the U.S. Army of former Confederate states, during which former slaves exercised civil and human rights for the first time in American history. The Union victory in the Civil War and the subsequent Reconstruction period in the southern states brought momentous change to this country. But these events, however earth-shaking, do not correspond to the Second American Revolution of Reverend Lawson's analysis. Why not? Because the abrupt abandonment of the Reconstruction project and the horrific period of reaction and retrenchment that followed effectively erased nearly all of the gains that African Americans had achieved. In retrospect, Reconstruction was a relatively brief transitional period terminated by the Compromise of 1877, which removed federal troops from the South. After all the bloodshed of the Civil War, again, U.S. politicians agreed to a rotten compromise, choosing appeasement and retrenchment over justice. The end of Reconstruction effectively condemned African Americans in the former Confederacy to re-enslavement under new forms of coercion for decades to come. Throughout the South, blacks were coerced into indentured servitude and forced labor by white plantation owners, by corporations such as U.S. Sugarcane, and by race-based prison industrial systems. State legislatures codified white supremacy into a legal system of racial separation enforced by state and municipal authorities, a system known informally as Jim Crow. Meanwhile, violations of forced subservience were handled through extrajudicial means, including lynching carried out by racist terror organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. Following World War II, the system of indentured servitude and related forms of coerced labor ended. Still, black soldiers from southern states who fought in World War II against racist regimes in Germany and Japan came home to an entrenched system of racist laws, depriving African Americans of equal access to integrated facilities and services, with police forces either affiliated with the Klan or subject to the understanding that it's necessary to look the other way when vigilante justice was imposed against black people. The first signal of hope and change came in 1954 and 1955 from the Supreme Court's landmark decisions in Brown v. Board of Education. The Brown Court declared that laws requiring racial segregation of public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which provides, no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. I describe the decision as a signal of hope and change, a signal rather than a consummation, because in issuing the Brown decisions, the Supreme Court did not achieve its announced goal, to end legally enforced racial segregation in public education and other public facilities with all deliberate speed. On the contrary, in the immediate wake of the Brown decision, the system of white supremacy and Jim Crow segregation became even more firmly entrenched. Southern politicians and officials openly declared their unified policy of massive resistance to the Supreme Court's orders, which they labeled tyranny. At this point, I've set the backdrop for a thought experiment that I would like to share with you. Imagine being a citizen of a city in the Deep South in 1955, the year following the announcement of the first Brown decision. Birmingham, Alabama, for example, or Albany, Georgia, or Jackson, Mississippi. Imagine yourself white or black. For purposes of our exercise in imagination, it doesn't matter. Either way, you're living in a society in which African American parents are required by law to send their sons and daughters to a school for colored children only, and prohibited by law to send their children to a school reserved for whites only. Public school facilities, educational materials, and financial investment made by the city and state for white students are vastly superior to the facilities and resources provided to black students. Moreover, black high school graduates are prohibited by law to attend your state university system. You're living in a state where a wide variety of mechanisms are in place to deprive African Americans of the vote. Poll taxes, literary tests, electoral fraud, restricted registration practices, and overt intimidation. These techniques established in the immediate post-Reconstruction era remain the law of the land in 1955. As a result, only a tiny fraction of black citizens are registered to vote. And white supremacy is the dominant ideology of elected officials at the state and municipal level. State law prohibits African Americans from taking a drink from a whites-only water fountain, from ordering a Coke at a whites-only lunch counter, from sitting at the whites-only waiting room at the bus station or the whites-only section of the front of the bus. Blacks don't violate segregation ordinances because they know the price that will be paid. And the entire system is enforced by police brutality and racist terror. Everyone understands that whoever attempts to openly define the white male power structure will be subject to extrajudicial violence, whether in the form of KKK cross-burning, beatings, or murder. As a result, black communities are largely silent and acquiescent in the face of racist oppression and structural violence, not because they accept the system, but because their survival requires it.